You won't believe what Marcus has been telling everyone at tech conferences, my colleague Jessica whispered urgently as she slid into the booth across from me at Brew and Bites, our usual coffee spot in downtown Seattle. Her voice dropped to that conspiratorial tone that immediately made my stomach clench. He's presenting your smart irrigation system as his own invention. Claims he developed the entire concept himself while working late nights in his garage. Nearly choked on my vanilla latte, the ceramic mug trembling slightly in my hands. He's saying what? Jessica leaned closer, her expression a mixture of concern and barely contained outrage. I heard it straight from David Chen at the Northwest Tech Summit yesterday. Marcus gave this whole presentation about his revolutionary IoT agricultural solution and how he's been developing it independently for the past 2 years. David said he was incredibly convincing, had detailed prototypes, technical specifications, the works. The coffee shop's ambient noise, the hiss of the espresso machine, the gentle murmur of conversations, the soft jazz playing overhead, suddenly felt overwhelming. This wasn't just another of Marcus's exaggerations or his tendency to embellish stories at family gatherings. This was something far more calculated and devastating. My name is Sarah Chen, and at 28 years old, I was about to discover just how far sibling rivalry could go when intellectual property and family dynamics collided in the most destructive way possible. The smart irrigation system that had consumed 2 years of my life, representing countless sleepless nights of coding, engineering, and testing, was being stolen right out from under me. And somehow, I'd found myself at the center of a storm I never saw coming. What happened next would change our family forever and expose truths that had been festering beneath the surface for years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Bellevue as the youngest of 2 children in the Chen family came with its own unique set of challenges and expectations. My parents, David and Linda Chen, had immigrated from Taiwan in the early 1990s with nothing but engineering degrees, unwavering determination, and dreams of building a better life for their future children. Through sheer persistence and brilliant problem-solving skills, my father had worked his way up from a junior software engineer to the chief technology officer of a mid-sized tech company, while my mother had established herself as a respected civil engineer specializing in sustainable infrastructure projects. From the outside, we appeared to be the quintessential American success story. Comfortable suburban home with a meticulously maintained garden, 2 cars in the driveway, annual family vacations to national parks, and children who excelled academically. But within our family structure, there had always been an unspoken but deeply entrenched hierarchy, with my older brother Marcus firmly positioned at the top of the family pedestal. Marcus was everything our parents had dreamed their first child would become. At 31, he was tall, charismatic, and possessed an almost magnetic confidence that drew people to him in professional and social settings. He had graduated from the University of Washington with a computer science degree, landing a coveted position at a prominent tech startup where he quickly climbed the ranks to become a senior product manager. His career trajectory seemed effortless, marked by the kind of natural networking ability and strategic thinking that our parents viewed as the perfect embodiment of American professional success. My parents doted on Marcus with an intensity that bordered on worship. Every promotion, every successful project launch, every recognition he received at work became a family celebration. They would beam with pride when neighbors asked about their son's latest achievements, never failing to mention his salary increases, his growing team, or the innovative products he was supposedly developing. The fact that Marcus had never actually created anything truly groundbreaking himself seemed irrelevant to their narrative of his success. And then there was me, the youngest, the one who had always been a bit different, a bit more introspective, a bit more focused on actually building things rather than managing teams or presenting polished PowerPoints to executives. Instead of following the traditional path of climbing corporate ladders and accumulating impressive job titles, I had pursued my passion for hands-on engineering with an almost obsessive dedication. After graduating from Washington State University, with degrees in both electrical engineering and computer science, I had deliberately chosen to work for a smaller agricultural technology company called Green Tech Solutions. While Marcus was attending networking events and strategic planning meetings, I was spending my days in labs and greenhouses, getting my hands dirty with soil sensors, irrigation controllers, and embedded systems programming. My mother would often refer to my job as that little farming thing when friends asked, a dismissive tone that made it clear she viewed my career as somehow less legitimate than Marcus's corporate achievements. The irony wasn't lost on me. While my parents celebrated Marcus's ability to manage existing technologies and present other people's innovations, I was actually inventing new solutions to real-world problems. But innovation that happened in labs and field tests didn't carry the same social currency as corner offices and management titles. So, what exactly is Marcus claiming about your irrigation system? Jessica asked, bringing me back to our conversation at Bruin Bites. Her question carried the weight of genuine concern mixed with professional curiosity. As a fellow engineer, she understood both the technical complexity of what I'd developed and the devastating implications of intellectual property theft. I set down my latte, watching the foam art slowly dissolve as I tried to organize my thoughts. The smart irrigation system wasn't just a random project I'd worked on during spare time. It represented the culmination of everything I'd learned about sustainable agriculture, IoT integration, and water conservation technology. The system used a network of soil moisture sensors, weather data integration, and machine learning algorithms to optimize water usage for different crop types, while reducing waste by up to 40% compared to traditional irrigation methods. The system monitors soil conditions in real time, I began, my voice gaining strength as I described the technical details. It uses a combination of capacitive moisture sensors and pH monitors connected through a mesh network topology. The data gets processed by edge computing devices that can make irrigation decisions locally, even without internet connectivity, but also sync with cloud-based analytics for long-term optimization patterns. Jessica nodded, her eyes lighting up with the kind of appreciation that only came from understanding the complexity involved. That's incredibly sophisticated. The edge computing alone must have required months of development. 14 months, I confirmed. And that was just for the core algorithm. The hardware integration took another 8 months of prototyping and field testing. I paused, feeling a familiar surge of pride mixed with the current sting of betrayal. We tested it on 12 different farms across eastern Washington, from small organic operations to larger commercial facilities. The water savings were consistently impressive, but more importantly, crop yields actually improved because of the precision timing and customized watering schedules. The scope of what I'd accomplished was significant enough that agricultural equipment manufacturers had started reaching out to Green Tech Solutions about licensing opportunities. Universities were interested in incorporating the technology into their sustainable agriculture research programs. The system represented genuine innovation with real-world applications and measurable benefits. How could Marcus possibly claim he developed something that complex? Jessica asked, echoing the question that had been torturing me since she'd delivered the devastating news. He's a product manager, not an engineer. He doesn't have the technical background to create IoT hardware or write machine learning algorithms. That was exactly what made his theft so audacious and, simultaneously, so potentially effective. Marcus had always possessed an extraordinary ability to absorb and repackage other people's ideas in ways that made them seem like his own original concepts. Throughout our childhood and into our adult years, I had watched him take credit for group projects, present slightly modified versions of other people's proposals as breakthrough thinking, and generally position himself as the creative force behind collaborative efforts. But this went far beyond his usual pattern of taking credit for team accomplishments. This was outright intellectual property theft of a complex technical system that had required specialized knowledge and extensive development time. "I think he's been watching my work more closely than I realized," I said slowly, piecing together the implications as I spoke. "Marcus has visited the Green Tech offices several times over the past year. He always claimed he was just stopping by to see how his little sister was doing, maybe take me out for lunch. But now I'm wondering if he was actually gathering information about my projects." The more I thought about it, the more unsettling details emerged from my memory. Marcus asking seemingly casual questions about my work during family dinners. His sudden interest in agricultural technology, despite never having shown any concern for farming or sustainability issues before. The way he would steer conversations toward my current projects, always framing his curiosity as brotherly support and genuine interest in my career. He's been pumping me for information, I realized with growing horror. All those lunches, all those questions about technical challenges I was facing, all those requests to see prototypes because he was so proud of his engineering sister. He was systematically gathering intelligence about my work. Jessica's expression hardened. "That's not just theft, Sarah. That's calculated, premeditated theft. He's been planning this for months, maybe longer." The betrayal felt like a physical weight settling in my chest. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a misunderstanding that could be cleared up with a simple conversation. This was a deliberate, systematic effort by my own brother to steal the most significant professional achievement of my life and claim it as his own. "What are you going to do?" Jessica asked gently, recognizing the emotional impact of what we were discussing. I stared out the coffee shop window at the Seattle skyline, watching the afternoon light reflect off the glass. Towers downtown. Somewhere in one of those buildings, Marcus was probably sitting in a conference room, presenting my stolen innovation to potential investors or corporate partners, building his career and reputation on the foundation of my work. The obvious answer was to confront him directly, to demand that he stop claiming credit for my invention and publicly acknowledge the truth. But I knew Marcus well enough to predict how that conversation would unfold. He would deny everything, claim I was being paranoid or jealous of his success, and probably find a way to turn the situation around so that I appeared to be the unreasonable one attacking her successful older brother. "I need to protect my work," I said finally, the decision crystallizing as I spoke. "Before I confront Marcus or involve the family, I need to make sure I have legal protection for my intellectual property." It seemed like such a straightforward plan. Document my development process, file the necessary patent applications, gather evidence of my original work, and then address Marcus's theft from a position of legal strength. What I didn't realize then was that the situation was far more complicated than a simple case of stolen ideas, and that Marcus had been planning his theft with a level of sophistication that would shock even me. The next morning, I arrived at the Green Tech Solutions office earlier than usual, determined to begin the process of protecting my intellectual property. Our small company occupied the second floor of a converted warehouse in the Sodo district, the kind of industrial chic space that housed dozens of Seattle startups focused on sustainable technology and innovative engineering solutions. My supervisor, Dr. Robert Martinez, was already at his desk when I knocked on his office door. A former university professor who had transitioned into commercial agricultural technology development, Robert had been my mentor and biggest supporter since I'd joined the company. His office walls were covered with patents, research publications, and photos from field tests at farms across the Pacific Northwest. "Sarah, you're here early," he observed, looking up from a stack of grant applications with a welcoming smile. "What's on your mind?" I explained the situation with Marcus as objectively as possible, trying to keep emotional reactions out of my description of the facts. Robert listened intently, his expression growing more serious as I detailed the extent of Marcus's apparent theft and the potential damage to both my career and GreenTech's intellectual property portfolio. "This is more serious than just a family dispute," Robert said when I finished. "If your brother is claiming ownership of technology that belongs to Green Tech Solutions, he could be creating liability issues for both companies involved. We need to take immediate action to protect our intellectual property and your contributions." The legal implications were more complex than I had initially realized. The smart irrigation system had been developed during my employment at Green Tech, using company resources and as part of my assigned research projects. While I was the primary inventor and developer, the technology legally belonged to the company, not to me personally. Marcus wasn't just stealing from me. He was essentially stealing from Green Tech Solutions. "What's our next step?" I asked, grateful to have Robert's experience and institutional support. He pulled out a legal pad and began making notes as he spoke. "First, we need to document everything: your development timeline, all the research notes, prototype iterations, test results, everything that establishes the chronology of your work. Second, we need to contact our intellectual property attorney to discuss filing patent applications immediately. And third, we need to gather evidence of your brother's theft so we can determine what legal actions might be necessary." The process of documenting my work proved to be both vindicating and emotionally overwhelming. As I compiled folders of research, notes, technical drawings, code repositories, and field test data, the scope of what I had accomplished became undeniably clear. The smart irrigation system represented nearly 2 years of intensive, methodical development work that had produced genuine innovation with measurable real-world benefits. More importantly, the documentation revealed a clear timeline that would make it impossible for Marcus to credibly claim independent development of the same technology. My earliest research notes dated back 22 months, with continuous development documented through code commits, prototype photos, and detailed test results from multiple agricultural sites. "This is incredibly thorough work, Sarah," Robert commented as we reviewed the compiled documentation. "Not only does this establish clear ownership and development timeline, but it also demonstrates the sophistication and commercial viability of your innovation. This technology could revolutionize water management in agriculture." The compliment should have felt gratifying, but instead it amplified my anger at Marcus's betrayal. He was stealing not just an idea, but years of dedicated work that represented the best of my professional capabilities and personal passion for sustainable technology. As we prepared the documentation for our intellectual property attorney, I couldn't help but think about the family dynamics that had enabled Marcus's sense of entitlement to other people's achievements. Throughout our childhood, our parents had consistently praised his ability to take charge and show leadership, even when those qualities manifested as taking credit for group projects or presenting other people's ideas as his own innovations. What I was beginning to understand was that Marcus's theft of my irrigation system wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of a lifelong pattern of appropriating other people's work that had been rewarded and reinforced by our family's admiration for his supposed creativity and business acumen. The question now was whether I had the courage to expose that pattern and fight for recognition of my own legitimate achievements, even if it meant challenging the family narrative that had positioned Marcus as the successful child and me as the one pursuing that little farming thing. What I didn't know then was that the battle ahead would reveal not only the extent of Marcus's deception, but also long-hidden truths about our family that would change everything I thought I understood about my place in the Chen legacy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The intellectual property attorney's office occupied the 32nd floor of a gleaming downtown Seattle tower, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. Margaret Walsh had built her reputation defending tech innovators against corporate theft and patent disputes, her walls lined with framed certificates and photos with grateful clients who had successfully protected their life's work from appropriation. This is one of the most comprehensive development portfolios I've seen for an agricultural technology patent, Margaret said, reviewing the documentation Robert and I had compiled over the past week. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her sharp blue eyes missed nothing as she methodically examined each piece of evidence. The timeline alone makes it virtually impossible for anyone to credibly claim independent development of identical technology. I felt a surge of validation hearing those words from someone with Margaret's expertise and experience. The past week had been emotionally exhausting as I'd relived every detail of my innovation process, but the legal assessment confirmed what I'd known all along. My work was original, substantial, and well-documented. What's our strongest legal position? Robert asked, leaning forward in his chair with the intensity of someone who had dealt with intellectual property disputes before during his academic career. Margaret consulted her notes, tapping her Mont Blanc pen against the leather portfolio. We have multiple avenues for protection and potential legal action. First, we'll file comprehensive patent applications immediately, both for the core irrigation optimization algorithm and for the integrated hardware-software system architecture. The documentation Sarah has provided will establish clear priority dates that predate any possible claims from her brother. She turned to a fresh page in her legal pad. Second, if her brother is indeed presenting this technology publicly at conferences and to potential business partners, he may be creating evidence of willful patent infringement that could result in significant financial penalties and injunctive relief. The legal terminology was reassuring, but I found myself focusing on the human element of the situation. What? About the family implications? I asked, voicing the concern that had been keeping me awake at night. This isn't just about protecting intellectual property. It's about accusing my brother of theft. Margaret's expression softened slightly, revealing the empathy that made her particularly effective at handling cases involving family disputes. I understand this is incredibly difficult, Sarah. Family intellectual property disputes are among the most emotionally challenging cases I handle. But you need to consider the long-term consequences of allowing this theft to continue unchallenged. She gestured toward the pile of documentation on her desk. Your brother isn't just claiming credit for an idea he had over coffee one morning. He's appropriating years of sophisticated technical development that represents your professional identity and career trajectory. If he successfully establishes himself as the inventor of this technology, it could impact your ability to develop related innovations, pursue advanced positions in agricultural technology, or even receive proper recognition for future work. The implications were more far-reaching than I had initially considered. Marcus wasn't just stealing my current achievement, he was potentially hijacking my entire professional future in the agricultural technology sector. There's another consideration, Robert added grimly. If Marcus is presenting this technology to investors or potential licensing partners, he could be creating legal liability for any companies that enter into agreements based on his false claims of ownership. When the truth comes out, and it will come out, there could be significant financial consequences for everyone involved. Margaret nodded in agreement. Which is why we need to act quickly and decisively. The longer this deception continues, the more complicated and expensive it becomes to unravel. We spent the next hour developing a comprehensive legal strategy that would protect my intellectual property while gathering evidence of Marcus's theft. Margaret would begin filing patent applications immediately, using the extensive documentation I had provided to establish clear priority dates. Simultaneously, she would initiate a discreet investigation into Marcus's activities, including his conference presentations and any business partnerships he might be developing based on the stolen technology. I need to ask you something difficult, Margaret said as our meeting concluded. Are you prepared for the possibility that your brother's theft is more extensive than you currently realize? In my experience, intellectual property thieves rarely limit themselves to a single innovation, especially when they believe they can get away with it. The question sent a chill through me. I had been so focused on the smart irrigation system that I hadn't considered whether Marcus might have stolen other ideas or innovations from me over the years. As I thought back through our interactions, particularly his visits to the green tech offices and his seemingly casual questions about my various projects, I began to see a pattern of systematic information gathering that extended beyond just the irrigation technology. "What should I be looking for?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Any technical concepts, research directions, or innovative approaches that you've discussed with him that later appeared in his professional presentations or projects," Margaret replied. "Patent theft often involves multiple innovations because the perpetrator becomes overconfident after initial success." The drive back to the green tech offices gave me time to process the magnitude of what we were potentially dealing with. This wasn't just about one stolen invention. It could be about a systematic pattern of intellectual property theft that had been going on for years without my recognition. I called Jessica as soon as I reached my desk, needing to talk through the situation with someone who understood both the technical and emotional complexities involved. "How did the attorney meeting go?" she asked immediately upon answering. "Complex," I replied, settling into my office chair and staring at the whiteboard covered with diagrams and formulas from my latest research projects. "Margaret thinks we have a strong case for the irrigation system, but she's concerned that Marcus's theft might be more extensive than we realized." There was a pause as Jessica absorbed this information. "You mean he might have stolen other innovations from you?" That's exactly what she means. I'm trying to think back through all the projects I've discussed with him over the years, all the technical challenges I've mentioned during family gatherings or when he's visited the office. I rubbed my temples, feeling the beginning of a tension headache. The problem is, I trusted him. I shared details about my work because I thought he was genuinely interested in supporting his little sister's career. Jessica's voice took on an edge of anger that matched my own growing fury. "That makes it worse, Sarah. He exploited your trust and family relationship to commit professional theft. That's not just unethical, it's psychologically manipulative." As we talked, I began to remember specific instances that took on new significance in light of Margaret's warnings. 6 months ago, Marcus had asked detailed questions about my research into soil pH optimization algorithms, claiming he was curious about how machine learning could be applied to agricultural problems. 3 months later, I had heard through industry contacts that his company was developing innovative pH management solutions for their agricultural technology division. "Oh my God," I whispered as another memory surfaced. "Last year, when I was developing the mesh network topology for sensor communication, Marcus spent an entire Sunday afternoon asking me to explain the technical challenges involved. He said he was fascinated by IoT architecture and wanted to understand how I was solving connectivity problems in rural environments." "And?" Jessica prompted, sensing there was more to the story. 2 months later, his company announced a breakthrough in rural IoT connectivity solutions that became a major selling point for their agricultural product line. My hands were shaking as I realized the scope of what Marcus had been doing. "Jessica, I think he's been systematically stealing my innovations for over a year, maybe longer." The implications were staggering. Not only had Marcus appropriated my smart irrigation system, but he had apparently been building his professional reputation and his company's agricultural technology division on a foundation of stolen innovations from his own sister. "You need to document everything," Jessica said firmly. "Every conversation you can remember, every technical discussion, every project you mentioned to him. If Margaret is right about this being a pattern, you need to establish the full scope of the theft." That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and my laptop, systematically reconstructing every technical conversation I'd had with Marcus over the past 2 years. The process was both revealing and nauseating as I began to see how he had manipulated family gatherings and sibling interactions to gather intelligence about my professional work. The pattern was undeniable. Marcus would express interest in my projects, ask probing questions about technical challenges and innovative solutions, and then disappear for months before suddenly announcing that his company had developed breakthrough technologies in suspiciously similar areas. What I had interpreted as brotherly support and genuine curiosity had actually been calculated industrial espionage. My phone rang just as I was documenting the third potential theft, the caller ID showing my parents' home number. For a moment, I considered not answering, knowing that any conversation with my parents about Marcus would be complicated by their unwavering faith in his integrity and success. "Hi, Mom," I answered, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Sarah, honey, I have the most exciting news." My mother's voice practically bubbled with enthusiasm. "Marcus just called to tell us that his company is about to announce a major partnership with Agricultural Dynamics Corporation. They're going to be licensing his innovative irrigation technology for nationwide distribution." The irony was so bitter I could taste it. Agricultural Dynamics Corporation was one of the companies that had been courting green tech solutions about licensing my smart irrigation system. Marcus had not only stolen my innovation, he was now profiting from it, with the exact same company that had expressed interest in the legitimate version. "That's wonderful," I managed to say, though the words felt like poison in my mouth. "He's going to be featured in AgTech Weekly magazine next month," my mother continued, oblivious to my distress. "They're calling him one of the rising stars in agricultural innovation. Your father and I are so proud we could burst." AgTech Weekly was the premier publication in our industry. Being featured as a rising star would establish Marcus as a leading voice in agricultural technology innovation, a reputation built entirely on my stolen work. The professional recognition I should have received was being handed to my brother, along with the financial benefits and career opportunities that would follow. "I have to go, Mom," I said, feeling sick to my stomach. "I'll talk to you later." After ending the call, I sat in my kitchen staring at the documentation I'd been compiling, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of Marcus's betrayal and the challenge of proving systematic intellectual property theft against someone our parents considered a golden child. My laptop chimed with a new email notification. The message was from Dr. Emily Rodriguez, a research colleague at Washington State University, who had collaborated with me on several agricultural sustainability projects. "Sarah," the email read, "I attended the Pacific Northwest Agricultural Innovation Summit yesterday and was surprised to see your brother presenting research that seemed remarkably similar to the soil optimization work you published last year. I thought you should know that several attendees were confused about the apparent duplication of research findings. Please call me when you have a chance to discuss this." Emily's email confirmed my worst fears. Marcus wasn't just stealing my current work. He was appropriating research I had already published and presenting it as his own original innovation. The theft was not only systematic, but incredibly audacious, showing a complete disregard for professional ethics and intellectual honesty. I forwarded Emily's email to Margaret Walsh with a brief note explaining the significance of this new evidence, then continued documenting every technical conversation and potential theft I could remember. By midnight, I had identified at least 5 separate innovations that Marcus appeared to have stolen and incorporated into his company's agricultural technology offerings. The next morning brought another devastating revelation when Jessica called, with information from her network of industry contacts. "Sarah, I've been making some discreet inquiries about your brother's recent activities," she began, her tone serious. "It's worse than we thought. Marcus isn't just presenting your work at conferences, he's been approaching your former collaborators and research partners, claiming that you've been building on his foundational work rather than the other way around." The strategic sophistication of Marcus's deception was breathtaking. He wasn't just stealing my innovations. He was rewriting the history of their development to position himself as the original innovator, and me as someone who had built upon his foundational work. If successful, this narrative inversion would make it nearly impossible for me to receive proper credit for my own achievements. "How many people has he contacted?" I asked, dreading the answer. "At least 6 that I know of, including Dr. Rodriguez and the team at Pacific Agricultural Research," Institute. He's been very persuasive, apparently, presenting himself as the senior researcher whose work has been adapted by various junior engineers, including you. The calculated nature of Marcus's theft was becoming clear. This wasn't an opportunistic appropriation of a single innovation. It was a comprehensive campaign to steal my professional identity and reposition himself as the original source of my work. The family trust and support that had made me vulnerable to his information gathering was now being weaponized to destroy my career and reputation. As I hung up with Jessica, I realized that confronting Marcus directly would no longer be sufficient. The scope and sophistication of his theft required a legal response that would not only protect my intellectual property, but also expose the full extent of his professional deception. The question now was whether I had the courage to pursue a legal battle that would inevitably tear our family apart and force our parents to confront the reality that their golden child was a calculating thief who had built his career on stolen innovations from his own sister. What I didn't know then was that Margaret Walsh's investigation would uncover evidence that would shock even me, revealing that Marcus's theft was not only more extensive than we had imagined, but that he had been planning his appropriation of my work with a level of premeditation that bordered on criminal conspiracy. Margaret Walsh's investigation moved with the methodical precision of someone who had handled dozens of intellectual property disputes, but even she seemed surprised by the depth of evidence we were uncovering. When she called me into her office 3 days after our initial meeting, her expression carried a gravity that immediately put me on edge. "Sarah, I need to show you something that changes the entire scope of this case," she began, gesturing to her computer screen where multiple browser windows displayed what appeared to be patent filing documents. "My investigative team discovered that your brother hasn't just been stealing your innovations, he's been attempting to patent them under his own name." The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank into the chair across from her desk, staring at the screen in disbelief. There, in official United States Patent and Trademark Office documentation, were detailed descriptions of my smart irrigation system, my soil optimization algorithms, and my mesh network topology, all filed under Marcus Chen as the sole inventor. "This was filed 6 weeks ago," Margaret continued, pointing to the smart irrigation patent application. "The filing date is what makes this particularly egregious. Based on your development timeline, Marcus would have needed access to your completed research to submit these specifications. This isn't just theft, it's premeditated fraud." My hands trembled as I absorbed the implications. Marcus hadn't just been stealing my work to enhance his professional reputation. He had been systematically attempting to secure legal ownership of my innovations through the patent system. If successful, these filings would give him the exclusive right to license and profit from technologies I had developed, while simultaneously preventing me from receiving any credit or compensation for my own work. "Can he actually get these patents?" I asked, my voice barely steady. Margaret shook her head with conviction. "Not if we act quickly. Your documented development timeline predates his filings by over 18 months. We have overwhelming evidence of prior art and invention records that will invalidate his applications. But Sarah, this discovery means we're no longer dealing with simple intellectual property theft. We're potentially looking at patent fraud, which carries serious legal consequences." The criminal implications of Marcus's actions were beginning to crystallize. This wasn't just a civil matter between siblings or competing companies. It was potential federal fraud involving false statements to a government agency. "What are our options?" I asked, trying to process the legal complexity of the situation. "We have several paths forward," Margaret replied, pulling out a fresh legal pad to outline our strategy. "First, we'll file immediate prior art challenges to all of Marcus's patent applications, using your development documentation to establish clear invention priority. Second, we'll file our own patent applications with your proper authorship and earlier development dates. And third, we need to consider whether to report the fraudulent filings to the USPTO's investigation division. The decision to report Marcus for patent fraud would cross a line from which there would be no return. It would transform a family dispute into a federal investigation that could result in criminal charges against my brother. "I need time to think about the fraud reporting," I said, feeling overwhelmed by the gravity of the decision. "Can we proceed with the prior art challenges and our own patent filings first?" Margaret nodded understandingly. "Of course. Those actions will protect your intellectual property regardless of what we decide about the fraud investigation. But, Sarah, you should know that if other parties discover the fraudulent filings independently, the situation could escalate beyond our control." As I left Margaret's office, I felt the weight of a decision that would fundamentally alter my relationship with my family. The evidence of Marcus's systematic theft was now undeniable and legally documented, but pursuing justice would require me to potentially destroy my brother's career and expose him to criminal prosecution. I drove home through Seattle traffic, in a daze, my mind cycling through memories of childhood interactions with Marcus, searching for signs of the calculated deception that had apparently been present even then. Had he always been capable of this level of betrayal? Or was this a recent development driven by professional ambition and financial pressure? My phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. "Family dinner Sunday at 6 p.m. Marcus has exciting news to share about his latest project. Can't wait to celebrate together." The irony of being invited to celebrate Marcus's theft of my own work was so bitter it almost made me laugh. But it also presented an opportunity I hadn't considered, a chance to observe Marcus's behavior when he was presenting my stolen innovations to our family, potentially gathering additional evidence of his deception while deciding how to proceed with the confrontation that was now inevitable. I replied, confirming my attendance, then spent the rest of the evening preparing for what would likely be one of the most difficult conversations of my life. Sunday evening arrived with the typical Pacific Northwest drizzle that made Seattle feel cozy and intimate. My parents' Bellevue home was warm and welcoming as always, filled with the aroma of my mother's signature braised pork and the sound of classical music playing softly in the background. The familiar comfort of the environment made what I was about to do feel even more surreal and devastating. Marcus was already there when I arrived, looking relaxed and confident in an expensive sweater that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. He greeted me with his usual charming smile and brotherly hug, showing no sign of guilt or concern about his systematic theft of my professional work. "Sarah, perfect timing," he said with genuine seeming enthusiasm. "I was just telling Mom and Dad about the Agricultural Dynamics Partnership. It's going to revolutionize how farmers think about water management." The casual way he discussed my stolen innovation, presenting it as his own groundbreaking achievement to our parents, crystallized my resolve. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a momentary lapse in judgment. It was the behavior of someone who felt completely entitled to appropriate other people's work without consequence. "That sounds fascinating," I replied carefully, settling into my usual spot at the dinner table while my mother bustled around the kitchen making final preparations. "Tell me more about how you developed the technology." Marcus launched into a detailed explanation of the smart irrigation system, describing the technical specifications and innovative features with the fluency of someone who had indeed been intimately involved in its development. But as I listened, I noticed subtle inaccuracies in his description of the development process and theoretical assumptions that revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of the underlying engineering principles. The most challenging aspect was optimizing the machine learning algorithms for real-time decision-making, Marcus continued, his confidence growing as our parents listened with obvious pride and admiration. It took months of iteration to achieve the efficiency levels we needed for commercial viability. The phrase, "we needed," was particularly galling, given that Marcus had contributed nothing to the actual development process. But it also revealed something important about his psychological approach to the theft. He had genuinely convinced himself that he deserved credit for work he had merely observed and appropriated. How did you handle the edge computing integration? I asked, testing his technical knowledge with a question that any actual developer of the system would be able to answer in detail. Marcus hesitated for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty, crossing his face before he recovered with a general response about optimizing processing efficiency that revealed his lack of deep technical understanding. Our parents didn't notice the gap in his knowledge, but it confirmed what I already knew. Marcus was presenting work he didn't truly understand, relying on his natural charisma and presentation skills to mask his technical ignorance. The really exciting part, my father interjected proudly, is that Marcus has been invited to present his research at the International Agricultural Technology Conference next month. It's one of the most prestigious forums in the industry. My heart sank. The International Agricultural Technology Conference was indeed the premier event in our field, attended by the most influential researchers, investors, and industry leaders from around the world. If Marcus presented my stolen work at that venue, it would establish him as a recognized authority in agricultural innovation, while making it exponentially more difficult for me to receive proper credit for my own achievements. That's quite an honor, I managed to say, my voice strained with the effort of maintaining civility. The conference organizers specifically mentioned that they were impressed by the originality and practical applications of my irrigation technology, Marcus continued, either oblivious to or deliberately ignoring my obvious discomfort. They said it represents exactly the kind of innovative thinking that will shape the future of sustainable agriculture. The words, "my irrigation technology," hung in the air like an accusation. I found myself studying Marcus's face, searching for any sign of guilt or acknowledgement of what he was doing, but saw only the satisfied confidence of someone who believed he deserved the recognition he was receiving. Marcus has always been so creative and innovative, my mother added, beaming with maternal pride. Even as a child, he was constantly coming up with new ideas and solutions to problems. The childhood memories she was referencing involved Marcus taking credit for a science fair project that had actually been primarily developed by his study group, but presenting it as his individual achievement. I remembered feeling confused and hurt at the time, unable to understand why he would lie about something so easily verified. Now I realized it had been an early indication of a pattern that had apparently persisted and intensified throughout his adult life. Innovation runs in the family, my father agreed, raising his wine glass in a toast. We're lucky to have such talented children. The inclusion of me in his statement of pride would have been touching under different circumstances, but given the current situation, it felt like an unknowing mockery of my actual achievements being celebrated under Marcus's name. As dinner progressed, Marcus continued to elaborate on his supposed innovations, describing future research directions and commercial applications with the kind of visionary language that our parents found absolutely captivating. Each detail he shared was either directly stolen from my work or represented a fundamental misunderstanding of the technology he was claiming to have developed. The potential market for this technology is enormous, he explained, gesturing enthusiastically, as he outlined his business projections. Agricultural Dynamics estimates that we could capture 15% of the smart irrigation market within 3 years, generating over $50 million in licensing revenue. The financial figures represented my work being transformed into massive commercial success that would benefit everyone except the person who had actually created the technology. Marcus would receive the professional recognition, Agricultural Dynamics would profit from the innovation, and I would be left with nothing but the knowledge that my own brother had systematically stolen the most significant achievements of my career. What about patents? I asked, unable to resist probing the most damaging aspect of his theft. Have you filed for intellectual property protection? Marcus's expression brightened with obvious pleasure. Actually, yes. My attorney filed comprehensive patent applications last month. She said the innovation was so original and technically sophisticated that approval should be straightforward. The casual way he discussed patents filed for my stolen work, using Language that suggested legitimate ownership and development was the final confirmation I needed. Marcus wasn't just presenting my work as his own. He was actively working to secure permanent legal ownership of my innovations through fraudulent patent filings. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," my mother said, reaching over to squeeze Marcus's hand. "Your father and I are so proud of everything you've accomplished." Looking around the table at my family's obvious joy and pride in Marcus's supposed achievements, I felt a profound sadness that went beyond anger or betrayal. These people loved us both and had no idea that they were celebrating the systematic destruction of one child's career by the other. The decision I was facing would shatter their faith in Marcus and forever alter our family dynamics. But as I watched Marcus bask in praise for work he had stolen from me, I realized that allowing his theft to continue unchallenged would be an even greater betrayal of my own integrity, of the values my parents had taught us about honesty and hard work, and of every other innovator who might become his victim in the future. "Marcus," I said quietly, waiting until I had everyone's attention, "I need to ask you something important about your irrigation technology." Something in my tone must have alerted him to the shift in conversation, because his confident expression faltered slightly, replaced by a wariness that suggested he suspected what was coming. "Of course," he replied, his voice carefully neutral. "What would you like to know?" I took a deep breath, knowing that my next words would begin a confrontation. That would change our family forever. "I'd like to know why you're claiming to have invented technology that you stole from me." The silence that followed my accusation was deafening. The soft classical music that had been playing in the background seemed to amplify in the sudden stillness, and I could hear the rain pattering against the dining room windows with unusual clarity. My parents sat frozen, their wine glasses halfway to their lips, staring at me with expressions of shock and confusion. Marcus's face cycled through a rapid succession of emotions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally settling on the practiced expression of wounded innocence that I remembered from countless childhood disputes. "Sarah, I have no idea what you're talking about," he said, his voice carrying just the right combination of hurt and bewilderment. "Why would you say something like that? Especially in front of Mom and Dad?" The immediate deflection to make me appear as the aggressor was so predictable it almost made me laugh. Marcus had always been masterful at turning confrontations around, making his accusers seem unreasonable while positioning himself as the victim of unfair attacks. "I'm saying it because it's true," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "The smart irrigation system you've been presenting as your own invention is technology I developed at Green Tech Solutions over the past 2 years. Every technical specification you described tonight was stolen from my research." My mother set down her wine glass with trembling hands. "Sarah, honey, this is a very serious accusation. Are you certain you're not mistaken about something?" The gentle questioning in her voice revealed her instinctive desire to find a reasonable explanation that wouldn't require her to believe one of her children was capable of such systematic deception. But I had anticipated this response and come prepared with evidence that would be impossible to dismiss. I pulled out my phone and opened the folder containing development photos from my irrigation system testing. "Mom, Dad, I want you to look at these timestamps carefully," I said, handing the device to my father. "These are photos from my field tests in eastern Washington, taken 14 months ago. You can see the prototype hardware, the sensor configurations, even the early user interface displays." My father studied the screen with the analytical precision of an engineer, noting the metadata timestamps and technical details visible in the photographs. My mother leaned over to examine the images as well, her expression growing more troubled as she recognized the unmistakable similarity between what she was seeing and the technology Marcus had just been describing. "Marcus," my father said quietly, not looking up from the phone, "can you explain why Sarah has development photos of this technology that predate your supposed invention by over a year?" For the first time since I'd known him, Marcus appeared genuinely rattled. His usual confident demeanor cracked slightly, revealing the panic underneath as he realized that his preferred strategy of denial and deflection wouldn't work against documentary evidence. Those photos don't prove anything, he stammered, his voice lacking its usual conviction. Agricultural technology projects often involve similar approaches. Just because Sarah worked on something related doesn't mean I stole her ideas. Related? I repeated, pulling up additional documentation on my phone. Marcus, you described the exact mesh network topology I developed, down to the specific frequency protocols and power management algorithms. You quoted efficiency improvements. That matched my test results to the decimal point. This isn't similar technology. It's identical technology that you couldn't possibly have developed independently. I turned to my parents, knowing that their engineering backgrounds would help them understand the technical impossibility of Marcus's claims. Dad, you know how complex IoT development is. The probability of two engineers independently developing identical solutions to this many technical challenges is essentially zero. My father nodded slowly, his expression grave as he processed the implications. The technical specifications would indeed be virtually impossible to duplicate without access to the original development work, he admitted, his voice heavy with disappointment. Marcus's strategy shifted again, this time toward emotional manipulation. I can't believe my own sister would try to sabotage my career like this, he said, his voice rising with apparent indignation. Sarah, you've always been jealous of my success. Is this really how you want to handle your resentment? The accusation of jealousy was particularly galling, given that he was literally appropriating my achievements while claiming I was envious of success built on stolen work. But I had learned from Margaret Walsh's coaching that emotional reactions would undermine my credibility, so I maintained my composure and stuck to documented facts. Marcus, 3 days ago, I discovered that you've filed patent applications claiming to be the sole inventor of my irrigation technology, I said, watching his face for his reaction. The USPTO filing documents are public record. Would you like to explain how you managed to patent innovations that I developed and documented 18 months before your filing date? This revelation clearly caught Marcus completely off guard. His face went pale, and for a moment he seemed unable to speak. Our parents looked between us with growing horror as they began to understand the full scope of what was being alleged. You filed patents on Sarah's work? My mother asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus rallied one final time, his desperation now clearly visible. Those patent applications cover improvements and extensions of existing technology. I never claimed to invent the fundamental concepts. That's a lie, I interrupted, pulling up the patent documents on my phone and handing it to my father. Read the claims section, Dad. Marcus is listed as the sole inventor of the entire system. Architecture, including components that took me months to develop and test. My father read through the patent documentation with increasing dismay, his engineering expertise allowing him to understand exactly what Marcus had attempted to claim. When he looked up, his expression was one of profound disappointment and barely controlled anger. Marcus, these patent claims are indeed for the complete system Sarah described, he said, his voice tight with emotion. If what Sarah is saying is true, you've attempted to fraudulently patent technology that belongs to someone else. The word fraudulently hung in the air like an accusation of criminal behavior, which it essentially was. Patent fraud was a federal offense that could result in significant fines and even imprisonment. Marcus seemed to recognize that his position had become untenable. The combination of photographic evidence, technical documentation, and official patent filings had created an overwhelming case against him that couldn't be explained away through charm or deflection. Look, maybe I got carried away with the presentation, he finally admitted, though even his confession was carefully worded to minimize his culpability. But Sarah and I have discussed her work extensively over the years. The line between collaboration and individual innovation isn't always clear. There was no collaboration, I exploded, my carefully maintained composure finally breaking. You systematically gathered information about my projects during family visits and casual conversations, then presented my work as your own original innovations. You've been doing this for over a year, Marcus. This isn't a misunderstanding. It's calculated theft. My mother began to cry quietly, the full implications of the situation finally sinking in. Not only had one of her children systematically stolen from the other, but the theft had been enabled by the trust and family intimacy that should have protected both siblings from external threats. "Marcus, how could you do this to your sister?" she asked through her tears. "How could you do this to our family?" For a moment, Marcus's facade dropped completely, revealing something I had never seen in him before: genuine shame mixed with a kind of desperate vulnerability. When he spoke, his voice was hollow and defeated. "You don't understand the pressure I've been under," he said, not meeting anyone's eyes. "My company's agricultural division was failing. I was going to be demoted, maybe laid off entirely. When Sarah started describing these incredible innovations she was developing, I thought I could adapt some of her ideas to save my career." The admission was both a relief and a devastating confirmation of everything I had suspected. Marcus had indeed stolen my work, and he had done so deliberately to advance his own professional interests at the expense of mine. "But it wasn't just adaptation, was it?" I pressed, needing him to acknowledge the full extent of his deception. "You didn't just borrow ideas, you systematically appropriated complete technical solutions and filed patents to claim legal ownership of my innovations." Marcus finally looked directly at me, his expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Once I started, I couldn't stop. The technology was so successful that my entire reputation became built on it. If I admitted the truth, my career would have been over. So instead, you decided to destroy mine," I replied, the hurt and betrayal I'd been suppressing finally evident in my voice. "You were willing to steal my life's work and claim credit for innovations that took me years to develop." My father had been listening to this exchange with growing anger, his engineer's mind clearly cataloging the ethical violations and professional misconduct that Marcus was describing. "Marcus, do you realize that what you've done isn't just morally wrong? It's potentially criminal?" he asked, his voice carrying the weight of deep disappointment. "Patent fraud is a federal offense. You could face serious legal consequences for this." The mention of criminal liability seemed to bring Marcus back to the gravity of his situation. His earlier defensive anger was replaced by what appeared to be genuine panic, as he began to understand the legal jeopardy he had created for himself. "I never intended for it to go this far," he said, his voice now pleading. "I thought I could make some adjustments to Sarah's work and present it as my own development. I didn't realize how serious the patent implications would be." The claim of ignorance about patent law was particularly unconvincing given that Marcus had specifically sought legal counsel to file the fraudulent applications. But more importantly, his focus on the legal consequences rather than the harm he had caused me revealed the essentially selfish nature of his perspective on the entire situation. "The patent fraud is serious, Marcus, but what you've done to Sarah's career and reputation is just as devastating," my mother said, finding her voice again despite her obvious emotional distress. "She trusted you as her brother, and you exploited that trust to steal her professional achievements." As the full scope of Marcus's betrayal became clear to our parents, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sadness. I had been proven right about the theft, but the cost of that vindication was the destruction of our family's trust and unity. "What happens now?" my father asked, looking between Marcus and me with the expression of someone trying to navigate an impossible situation. I took a deep breath, knowing that my answer would determine not only my own future, but the trajectory of our family relationships for years to come. The evidence of Marcus's theft was overwhelming, and I had the legal resources to pursue justice through both civil and criminal channels. But the decision of how far to press the case would require me to balance my desire for justice against The potential destruction of my brother's life and career. That depends on Marcus, I said finally, looking directly at my brother. He has a choice to make about how he wants to handle the consequences of what he's done. The ball was now in Marcus's court, and his response would determine whether this family crisis could be resolved through acknowledgement and restitution, or whether it would escalate to a legal battle that would tear our family apart permanently. What none of us realized in that moment was that Marcus's choices had already set in motion events that would make a peaceful resolution impossible, and that the most shocking revelations were still to come. The drive home from my parents' house felt surreal, as if I was moving through a world that had fundamentally shifted while somehow remaining exactly the same. The familiar streets of Bellevue looked identical to how they had appeared just hours earlier. But everything felt different after the explosive confrontation that had just torn our family apart. Marcus had left immediately after his partial confession, mumbling something about needing time to think and figure out how to handle the situation. My parents had been too shocked and emotionally drained to continue the conversation, so we had agreed to reconvene in a few days, once everyone had processed what had been revealed. But as I sat in my apartment that night, staring out at the Seattle skyline, I knew that there would be no simple resolution to this crisis. Marcus's theft wasn't just a family problem that could be solved through apologies and better communication. It was a complex legal situation that would require professional intervention regardless of what my brother decided to do. My phone buzzed, with a text message from Jessica. "How did the family dinner go? Did you confront Marcus about the patents?" I called her immediately, needing to talk through what had happened with someone who understood both the technical and emotional complexities of the situation. It was devastating, I told her, recounting the evening's events in detail. Marcus basically admitted to stealing my work, but only after I presented overwhelming evidence. Even then, he tried to frame it as some kind of collaborative misunderstanding rather than deliberate theft. Jessica listened with growing anger as I described Marcus's attempts to justify his actions through claims of career pressure and professional necessity. "That's not an excuse, Sarah. That's exactly the kind of self-serving rationalization that makes his theft even more reprehensible. He put his own career advancement ahead of your professional integrity and family trust." "The worst part," I continued, "is that he seemed more concerned about the legal consequences for himself than about the harm he'd caused me. Even when he was supposedly confessing, it was all about minimizing his own culpability." "What did your parents say?" I sighed, feeling the emotional exhaustion of the evening settle over me. "They were shocked and disappointed, but I think they're still processing the full implications. My mom was crying, my dad looked like someone had punched him in the stomach. They raised us to believe in honesty and hard work, and now they're discovering that one of their children built his career on systematic theft from the other." The conversation with Jessica helped clarify my thinking about the path forward. While part of me wanted to find a way to resolve this privately within the family, the scope and sophistication of Marcus's theft made that increasingly unlikely. He had filed fraudulent patent applications, presented stolen work at industry, conferences, and secured business partnerships based on appropriated technology. The professional and legal implications extended far beyond our family dynamics. "You need to meet with Margaret Walsh first thing tomorrow," Jessica advised. "This confession changes everything from a legal standpoint. If Marcus has admitted to the theft, even partially, that could significantly strengthen your case for patent fraud prosecution." The next morning, I called Margaret's office and managed to secure an emergency appointment for that afternoon. When I arrived, I found her reviewing additional documentation that her investigative team had compiled over the weekend. "Sarah, I was going to call you this morning," she said as I entered her office. "We've discovered something that makes Marcus's situation even more serious than we initially realized." She gestured to a stack of printed documents on her desk. "My investigators found evidence that your brother has been approaching venture capital firms and agricultural equipment manufacturers with licensing proposals for the stolen technology. He's not just claiming credit for your work. He's actively trying to monetize it through commercial partnerships. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. It was one thing for Marcus to steal credit for my innovations to enhance his professional reputation, but attempting to profit financially from technology he had appropriated was an escalation that transformed the entire situation. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked, dreading the answer. Margaret consulted her notes. "Based on the preliminary agreements we found, Marcus could potentially earn between $2 and $5 million in licensing fees over the next 3 years if these partnerships move forward. He's essentially trying to build a multi-million-dollar business based entirely on your stolen innovations." The financial scale of Marcus's theft was staggering. He wasn't just appropriating my professional achievements. He was attempting to construct an entire business empire based on technology he had no right to claim or monetize. "There's more," Margaret continued grimly. "One of the venture capital firms he's been courting has expressed interest in funding a startup company focused on agricultural IoT technologies, with Marcus as the lead technologist and primary patent holder. If this investment goes through, your brother could become a multimillionaire while you receive no compensation or recognition for work that belongs to you." The entrepreneurial implications of Marcus's theft were even more devastating than I had imagined. Not only was he stealing my current achievements, but he was using them as the foundation for a business venture that would establish him as a leading innovator in agricultural technology while completely erasing my contributions from the historical record. I told Marcus last night that his next actions would determine how this situation unfolds, I said, my voice tight with anger. But if he's already this deep into commercializing my stolen work, I don't think there's any possibility of a private resolution. Margaret nodded in agreement. The commercial partnerships and investment discussions have created a situation where multiple parties beyond your family have a financial stake in the outcome. Even if Marcus wanted to come clean now, which seems unlikely given the money involved, there would be significant legal and financial complications for everyone who has entered into agreements based on his fraudulent claims. She pulled out a comprehensive legal strategy document that her team had prepared. "I recommend that we proceed immediately with a multi-pronged approach. First, we'll file formal complaints with the USPTO challenging all of Marcus's patent applications, based on prior art and fraud. Second, we'll file civil lawsuits against both Marcus and any companies that have entered into licensing agreements based on stolen technology. And third, we'll refer the matter to federal prosecutors for criminal investigation of patent fraud." The legal strategy was comprehensive and aggressive, designed to not only protect my intellectual property, but also to expose the full extent of Marcus's deception to potential criminal prosecution. It would be a path from which there would be no return, transforming our family dispute into a complex legal battle with potential criminal consequences. "What about the family implications?" I asked, thinking about my parents and the devastating impact this would have on their relationship with Marcus. Margaret's expression softened with understanding. "I know this is incredibly difficult, Sarah. Family intellectual property disputes are among the most emotionally challenging cases I handle. But you need to consider the long-term consequences of allowing Marcus's theft to continue unchallenged." She gestured toward the documentation of Marcus's commercial activities. "Your brother has moved far beyond simple credit taking. He's building a business empire based on your stolen work, and every day that passes makes it more difficult to unravel the commercial relationships he's establishing. If you don't act decisively now, you may lose any realistic chance of receiving proper recognition or compensation for your innovations." The decision was becoming clearer despite its emotional difficulty. Marcus had escalated his theft to a level that made private family resolution impossible. The involvement of venture capital firms, licensing agreements, and potential criminal fraud meant that this was no longer just about sibling rivalry or family dynamics. It was about protecting my professional future and holding Marcus accountable for systematic intellectual property theft. "Let's proceed with the full legal strategy," I decided, feeling a mixture of determination and sadness. Marcus has made his choice by escalating to commercial exploitation. Now, I need to make mine. Margaret began outlining the timeline for our legal actions, but our planning was interrupted by her assistant announcing an urgent call. After a brief conversation, Margaret hung up with an expression of surprise and concern. "That was interesting," she said, turning back to me. The call was from an attorney representing Agricultural Dynamics Corporation. Apparently, they've discovered some irregularities in Marcus's background and want to meet with us tomorrow to discuss their concerns about the licensing agreement they signed with him. This unexpected development suggested that Marcus's deception was beginning to unravel, even without our legal intervention. If Agricultural Dynamics had discovered problems with his credentials or claims, it could significantly accelerate the timeline for exposing his theft. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked. The attorney wasn't specific over the phone, but mentioned something about conflicting information regarding the development history of the irrigation technology. It sounds like they may have conducted their own due diligence investigation and discovered discrepancies in Marcus's claims. The possibility that Agricultural Dynamics had independently uncovered evidence of Marcus's theft was both encouraging and concerning. While it would strengthen our legal case, it also meant that the situation was spiraling beyond our control, potentially exposing Marcus to commercial liability beyond just the patent fraud issues. "This could actually work in our favor," Margaret observed. "If a major corporation has documentation questioning Marcus's claims, it provides independent verification of our allegations and could lead to additional evidence we haven't discovered yet." As I left Margaret's office that afternoon, I felt the weight of decisions that would fundamentally alter my relationship with my family and potentially destroy my brother's career and freedom. But I also felt a growing sense of resolve that came from understanding the full scope of what Marcus had done and the necessity of holding him accountable. The next 24 hours would bring revelations that none of us had anticipated, including evidence that Marcus's theft was even more systematic and calculating than we had imagined, and that his attempts to profit from my stolen work had created legal vulnerabilities that would ultimately lead to his downfall. That evening, my mother called with news that Marcus had contacted a criminal defense attorney, confirming that he understood the seriousness of his legal situation. But rather than seeking to make amends or negotiate a resolution, his decision to lawyer up suggested that he was preparing for a prolonged legal battle, rather than accepting responsibility for his actions. "Sarah, honey, I know you're angry and hurt," my mother said, her voice heavy with exhaustion and worry. "But Marcus is still your brother. Is there any way this can be resolved without destroying his life and tearing our family apart?" The question went to the heart of my emotional conflict. Despite everything Marcus had done, he was still my brother, and the thought of him facing criminal prosecution and financial ruin was genuinely painful. But his decision to escalate to commercial exploitation of my stolen work, combined with his apparent unwillingness to take responsibility for his actions, had created a situation where protecting my own future required pursuing justice regardless of the personal cost. "Mom, I didn't create this situation," I replied gently but firmly. "Marcus made the decision to steal my work, file fraudulent patents, and try to build a business empire based on technology he appropriated from me. The consequences he's facing now are the result of choices he made, not actions I'm taking against him." My mother was quiet for a long moment before responding. "I know you're right, Sarah. It's just heartbreaking to see our family torn apart like this." "It's heartbreaking for me too, Mom. But allowing Marcus to profit from theft while my own career suffers wouldn't preserve our family. It would just enable him to continue hurting people without consequences." As I ended the call with my mother, I reflected on how the situation had evolved from my initial discovery of Marcus's conference presentations to the complex legal and commercial battle that now lay ahead. What had started as sibling rivalry had become a case study in intellectual property theft, family betrayal, and the difficult choices required to seek justice when the perpetrator is someone you love. The meeting with Agricultural Dynamics the next day would reveal just how extensively Marcus had deceived his commercial partners, and how his web of lies was beginning to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. The Agricultural Dynamics Corporation headquarters occupied an entire block in downtown Seattle's business district, its modern glass facade reflecting the morning sun as Margaret and I approached the imposing entrance. As one of the largest agricultural equipment manufacturers in North America, Agricultural Dynamics wielded enormous influence in the industry, making their involvement in this situation both significant and potentially game-changing. The elevator ride to the 42nd floor felt eternal, my mind racing through possible scenarios for what we were about to discover. Margaret had coached me extensively on maintaining professional composure, regardless of what revelations emerged, but I could feel my heart rate accelerating as we approached what could be a pivotal moment in exposing Marcus's deception. We were escorted into a conference room with panoramic views of Puget Sound, where 3 individuals waited for us around a polished mahogany table. David Richardson, Agricultural Dynamics Chief Legal Counsel, was a distinguished man in his 50s with the bearing of someone accustomed to handling complex corporate disputes. Dr. Amanda Foster, their Vice President of Technology Development, appeared to be in her early 40s with the focused intensity of a scientist, comfortable navigating both technical and business environments. The third person, whom Richardson introduced as Michael Torres, was a private investigator specializing in corporate due diligence. Ms. Chen, Ms. Walsh, thank you for meeting with us on such short notice, Richardson began, his tone serious but professional. What we've discovered about Mr. Marcus Chen and the technology licensing agreement we signed with him has raised significant concerns that extend beyond simple contractual disputes. Dr. Foster opened a tablet and turned it toward us, displaying what appeared to be a comprehensive analysis document. When we first entered into negotiations with Mr. Chen, his presentation of the irrigation technology was extremely impressive. The technical specifications, efficiency improvements, and commercial applications all aligned perfectly with our strategic objectives for expanding into smart agricultural solutions. She paused, her expression becoming troubled. However, as we began the due diligence process for our licensing agreement, we discovered several inconsistencies that prompted us to conduct a more thorough investigation into the technology's development history. Michael Torres took over the presentation, pulling up a detailed timeline on the conference room's large display screen. Our investigation revealed that the core innovations Marcus Chen claimed to have developed were actually documented in academic publications and conference presentations by other researchers significantly before his supposed invention dates. The timeline he displayed was devastating to Marcus's claims. It showed my own research publications, conference presentations, and patent application dates in clear chronological order, followed by Marcus's much later attempts to claim credit for identical innovations. What made this particularly concerning, Torres continued, was that Mr. Chen had specifically assured us that he was the original inventor of all the technology covered by our licensing agreement. He provided detailed documentation that appeared to support his claims, including what he presented as his original research notes and development timeline. Richardson leaned forward, his expression grim. Ms. Chen, based on our investigation, it appears that your brother not only stole your intellectual property, but also created fraudulent documentation to support his theft. The research notes he provided to us were essentially plagiarized versions of your actual development work, with dates altered to make it appear that he had conducted the original research. The revelation that Marcus had created falsified documentation to support his theft was shocking even to me. I had known about the patent fraud and the appropriation of my technical work, but the discovery that he had systematically fabricated research records showed a level of premeditation and criminal intent that went far beyond opportunistic plagiarism. How extensive was this fraudulent documentation? Margaret asked, her legal mind immediately focusing on the evidence implications. Dr. Foster pulled up additional files on her tablet, Quite extensive, unfortunately. Mr. Chen provided us with over 200 pages of supposed research notes, development logs, and technical drawings that our analysis showed were modified versions of Ms. Chen's actual work. He had apparently spent considerable time and effort creating a convincing fake paper trail to support his claims of original invention. The scope of Marcus's deception was breathtaking. Creating fraudulent research documentation wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment or a situational response to career pressure. It was systematic fraud that required planning, effort, and a complete disregard for both professional ethics and legal consequences. We've also discovered, Torres added, that Mr. Chen approached at least 6 other companies with similar licensing proposals, all based on the same stolen technology. 3 of those companies have already signed preliminary agreements, worth approximately $8 million in total licensing fees. $8 million. The number hung in the air like an accusation of grand theft. Marcus wasn't just stealing my work. He was building a multi-million-dollar enterprise based entirely on technology he had appropriated from me while I received no recognition or compensation for innovations that represented years of my professional life. What's your company's position on the licensing agreement you signed with Marcus? Margaret asked, undoubtedly thinking about the legal implications for all parties involved. Richardson's expression was resolute. We're immediately terminating our agreement with Mr. Chen and demanding full restitution of any fees we've already paid. More importantly, we want to discuss the possibility of entering into a legitimate licensing arrangement with Ms. Chen, assuming she holds the actual intellectual property rights to this technology. The offer was both validating and surreal. After months of watching Marcus profit from my stolen work, a major corporation was now acknowledging my actual ownership of the technology and expressing interest in a proper business relationship. It felt like justice beginning to emerge from the chaos Marcus had created. We're also prepared to provide testimony and documentation to support any legal action Ms. Chen chooses to pursue against her brother, Dr. Foster added. Corporate intellectual property theft is something we take very seriously, and we want to ensure that the actual innovator receives proper recognition and compensation for her work. Margaret took detailed notes as we discussed the specifics of agricultural dynamics evidence and their willingness to cooperate with our legal strategy. Their documentation of Marcus's fraudulent research records would be particularly valuable in any criminal prosecution for patent fraud. There's one more thing you should know, Torres said as our meeting was concluding. Our investigation uncovered evidence that Mr. Chen has been engaging in similar practices with other types of technology beyond just the agricultural innovations he stole from you. This revelation was both surprising and troubling. If Marcus had been systematically stealing intellectual property from multiple sources, it would suggest a pattern of criminal behavior that extended far beyond his theft from me. What other technologies are we talking about? I asked, though I was almost afraid to hear the answer. Software applications, manufacturing processes, even marketing strategies, Torres replied. It appears that Mr. Chen has built his entire professional reputation on appropriated innovations from various sources. Your agricultural technology represents just one component of a much larger pattern of intellectual property theft. The implications were staggering. Marcus wasn't just a brother who had betrayed family trust. He was apparently a serial intellectual property thief who had built his entire career on stolen innovations from multiple victims. The thought that other inventors and researchers had suffered the same violation I was experiencing was both heartbreaking and infuriating. As Margaret and I left the Agricultural Dynamics building, I felt overwhelmed by the scope of what we had discovered. What had started as a family dispute over stolen innovation had evolved into evidence of systematic corporate fraud with multiple victims and millions of dollars in fraudulent licensing agreements. This changes everything, Margaret said as we walked to her car. With Agricultural Dynamics cooperation and their documentation of fraudulent research records, we now have an overwhelming case for both civil and criminal prosecution. The pattern of theft they've identified also supports federal RICO charges for ongoing criminal enterprise. RICO charges, the kind of serious federal prosecution typically reserved for organized crime and systematic fraud operations. The legal consequences Marcus was facing had escalated far beyond what any of us had initially imagined. "What about the other victims Torres mentioned?" I asked, thinking about the inventors and researchers who had suffered similar theft without knowing the source of their professional setbacks. "We'll need to identify them and determine whether they want to join our legal action," Margaret replied. "Multiple victims of the same perpetrator significantly strengthens the case for federal prosecution and increases the potential financial recovery for everyone involved." My phone buzzed with a call from my father as we reached Margaret's car. I answered hesitantly, uncertain what new developments might have emerged from Marcus's side of the situation. "Sarah, I need to tell you something," my father said without preamble, his voice tight with stress and disappointment. "Marcus came to the house this morning. He's asking for our help in dealing with what he's calling Sarah's vindictive legal attack against him." The characterization of my pursuit of justice as vindictive was infuriating, but not surprising. Marcus was apparently maintaining his victim narrative even in the face of overwhelming evidence of his systematic fraud. "What did you tell him?" I asked, bracing myself for my parents' response. "We told him that we couldn't support him in this situation," my father replied, his voice heavy with sadness. "Your mother and I have talked extensively since Sunday night, and we've concluded that you're doing what you have to do to protect your career and seek justice for what Marcus has done to you." The support from my parents was both a relief and a vindication. Despite their obvious pain at seeing our family torn apart, they had recognized the magnitude of Marcus's betrayal and were refusing to enable his continued deception. "He didn't take our response well," my father continued. "He accused us of choosing favorites and threatened to cut contact with the family entirely if we didn't support him against your legal action." Marcus's attempt to manipulate our parents through ultimatums and emotional blackmail was consistent with the calculating behavior he had displayed throughout this entire situation. Even when facing the consequences of his own criminal actions, he was trying to position himself as the victim and force others to choose sides. "Dad, I'm sorry this is tearing our family apart," I said, meaning it sincerely despite my determination to pursue justice. "This isn't your fault, Sarah," he replied, firmly. Marcus created this situation through his own choices and actions. The fact that there are consequences for theft and fraud isn't your responsibility. It's just the natural result of his behavior. As I ended the call with my father, I reflected on how the situation had evolved from a family dispute to a complex, legal case with multiple corporate victims and potential federal charges. Marcus's theft had been far more extensive and systematic than anyone had initially realized, affecting not just me, but numerous other innovators and researchers whose work had been appropriated to build his fraudulent career. The meeting with Agricultural Dynamics had provided crucial evidence and corporate support for our legal strategy, but it had also revealed the true scope of Marcus's criminal enterprise. The path forward would involve not just seeking justice for my own stolen innovations, but potentially helping to expose and prosecute a pattern of intellectual property theft that had victimized many others in the technology and research communities. What we didn't know yet was that Marcus's attempts to escape accountability would lead to even more desperate and destructive decisions that would ultimately seal his fate and provide the final pieces of evidence needed for federal prosecution. The federal courthouse in downtown Seattle felt imposing and surreal as I walked through its marble halls toward what would be one of the most consequential meetings of my life. 3 weeks had passed since our revelation-filled session with Agricultural Dynamics, and Margaret Walsh had been working around the clock to coordinate with federal prosecutors, corporate victims, and additional witnesses who had come forward with evidence of Marcus's systematic intellectual property theft. Today's meeting was with Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Morrison, who had been assigned to evaluate whether Marcus's activities warranted federal prosecution under various statutes, including wire fraud, mail fraud, and potentially RICO charges for operating a continuing criminal enterprise. The gravity of sitting in a federal prosecutor's office to discuss criminal charges against my own brother was almost overwhelming. Ms. Chen, I want you to understand that what we're discussing today represents one of the most comprehensive intellectual property theft cases our office has seen in recent years, Rachel Morrison began, her authoritative presence filling the conference room despite her relatively compact stature. At 45, she had built a reputation as one of the most effective federal prosecutors in the Pacific Northwest, specializing in white-collar crime and technology fraud. Margaret sat beside me, her own legal pad filled with notes and evidence, summaries we had compiled over the past month. The documentation now filled several bankers' boxes and included testimony from 8 different victims of Marcus's theft, along with corporate evidence from 4 major companies that had entered into fraudulent licensing agreements. The scope of Mr. Marcus Chen's alleged criminal enterprise is quite extensive, Morrison continued, consulting a thick case file. We've identified intellectual property theft spanning at least 3 years, affecting multiple victims across various technology sectors, with fraudulent licensing agreements totaling over $12 million. $12 million. The number represented not just the scale of Marcus's financial fraud, but the collective damage he had inflicted on numerous inventors, researchers, and companies who had trusted him with their innovations or entered into business relationships based on his false claims. What's particularly concerning from a prosecutorial standpoint, Morrison explained, is the level of sophistication and premeditation evident in Mr. Chen's activities. This wasn't opportunistic plagiarism or momentary lapses in professional judgment. The evidence suggests a systematic criminal enterprise designed to appropriate other people's intellectual property and monetize it through fraudulent business relationships. She pulled out a timeline that her investigators had compiled, showing Marcus's pattern of theft and commercialization across multiple victims and technology areas. The visual representation was damning, revealing a clear progression from simple credit-taking to elaborate fraud schemes involving falsified documentation and multi-million-dollar licensing agreements. The agricultural dynamics investigation was particularly valuable because it documented the extent to which Mr. Chen was willing to create fraudulent research records to support his theft, Morrison continued. Creating fake documentation to support patent fraud elevates this from civil intellectual property disputes to serious federal crimes with significant prison sentences. Prison sentences. The reality that Marcus could face years in federal prison was both a vindication of the seriousness of his crimes and a source of genuine sadness for me. Despite everything he had done, the thought of my brother in prison was painful, even as I recognized the necessity of holding him accountable for his systematic criminal behavior. Have you had any contact with Marcus since the family confrontation? Morrison asked, looking directly at me. Not directly, I replied, but he's been trying to reach me through various intermediaries. My parents said he's been asking them to convince me to drop the legal action, claiming that I'm overreacting and that everything can be resolved through family discussion. Morrison nodded grimly. That's consistent with what we typically see in white-collar fraud cases. The perpetrators often attempt to frame criminal prosecution as personal vendettas or family disputes, rather than acknowledging the serious legal violations they've committed. Margaret leaned forward. There's something else you should know about Marcus's recent activities. We have information suggesting that he's been attempting to destroy evidence and contact other potential victims to discourage them from cooperating with the investigation. This news was both shocking and deeply troubling. Obstruction of justice and witness tampering would add additional federal charges to Marcus's already serious legal jeopardy, but it also suggested that he was continuing to make choices that would worsen his situation rather than accepting responsibility for his actions. What kind of evidence destruction are we talking about? Morrison asked, her prosecutorial instincts clearly engaged. According to one of his former colleagues who contacted us confidentially, Marcus has been deleting files from his work computers and destroying physical documents related to his various technology licensing projects, Margaret replied. He's also apparently been contacting people who might have evidence of his theft, asking them to avoid cooperating with any legal investigations. Morrison made notes in her case file, her expression indicating that these developments would significantly strengthen the federal case against Marcus. Obstruction of justice and witness tampering are serious felonies that demonstrate consciousness of guilt. If we can document these activities, they'll substantially increase the potential penalties Mr. Chen is facing. As our meeting progressed, Morrison outlined the federal government's strategy for prosecuting Marcus's crimes. The case would likely involve multiple charges, including wire fraud for his electronic communications with victims and business partners, mail fraud for his fraudulent patent applications and licensing agreements, and potentially RICO charges if they could establish that his theft constituted an ongoing criminal enterprise. I need to ask you a difficult question, Ms. Chen, Morrison said as our discussion neared its conclusion. Are you prepared for the emotional and family consequences of a federal prosecution that could result in your brother serving significant prison time? The question went to the heart of my internal conflict throughout this entire ordeal. Pursuing justice for Marcus's theft was necessary to protect my own career and prevent him from victimizing others, but it would also potentially destroy his life and further fracture our family relationships. I've struggled with that question every day since this began, I admitted. But I've concluded that allowing Marcus to escape accountability for systematic criminal behavior wouldn't actually preserve our family. It would just enable him to continue hurting people without consequences. Morrison nodded approvingly. That's a mature and ethically sound perspective. In my experience, families that enable criminal behavior by refusing to hold perpetrators accountable often suffer more long-term damage than those that support justice, even when it's painful. As Margaret and I left the federal courthouse that afternoon, I felt the weight of decisions that had transformed a family dispute into a major federal criminal case. But I also felt a sense of resolution that came from understanding the scope of Marcus's crimes and the necessity of preventing him from continuing to victimize other inventors and researchers. My phone rang as we reached Margaret's car, the caller ID showing my mother's number. I answered with some trepidation, uncertain what new development might have emerged from my family's ongoing crisis. "Sarah, honey, I need to tell you something urgent," my mother said, her voice tight with stress and worry. "Marcus just called. He wants to meet with you privately to discuss what he's calling a resolution proposal for this situation." The timing of Marcus's outreach, coming immediately after my meeting with federal prosecutors, was suspicious and potentially problematic. Any contact with him at this point could complicate the criminal investigation and potentially expose me to accusations of interfering with the prosecution process. "Mom, I can't meet with Marcus privately while there's an ongoing criminal investigation," I explained. "Any contact between us at this point could be seen as witness tampering or obstruction of justice." He seemed very insistent, my mother continued, her voice revealing the emotional strain of being caught between her children during a legal crisis. "He said he has important information that could change everything, and that he needs to speak with you directly before it's too late." The claim of having important information that could change everything was exactly the kind of manipulation tactic I had come to expect from Marcus. He was likely attempting to either negotiate some kind of private settlement that would derail the federal prosecution, or to gather information about the criminal case that he could use to improve his legal position. "What exactly did he say?" I asked, wanting to understand his strategy while being careful not to engage in any communication that could compromise the investigation. "He said he's discovered evidence that other people were involved in the technology development, and that the situation isn't as simple as everyone believes," my mother replied. "He claims he has documentation that would exonerate him and show that you've misunderstood what actually happened." The supposed revelation of additional people involved in the development was almost certainly another fabrication designed to create doubt about my ownership of the stolen technology. Marcus had already demonstrated his willingness to create fraudulent documentation to support his false claims, so any evidence he might present would be suspect at best. Mom, Marcus has already created fraudulent research documents to support his theft, I reminded her. Federal investigators have confirmed that over 200 pages of documentation he provided to Agricultural Dynamics were falsified versions of my actual work. Any new evidence he claims to have is probably just additional fabrication. There was a long pause before my mother responded, her voice heavy with disappointment and exhaustion. Sarah, I don't know what to believe anymore. I raised both of you to be honest and ethical, and now I'm discovering that one of my children has apparently been living a lie for years, while the other is pursuing criminal charges that could send her brother to prison. The anguish in my mother's voice was heartbreaking, but it also reinforced my determination to see the criminal prosecution through to completion. Marcus's crimes hadn't just victimized me and other inventors. They had devastated our family's trust and forced our parents to confront the reality that they had raised a child capable of systematic criminal behavior. I understand this is incredibly difficult, Mom, I said gently. But Marcus created this situation through his own choices. The federal prosecution isn't something I'm doing to him. It's the natural consequence of the crimes he committed. After ending the call with my mother, I immediately contacted Margaret to report Marcus's attempt to arrange a private meeting. She confirmed my instinct that any direct contact with him at this point could compromise the criminal investigation and potentially expose me to additional legal risks. Marcus is clearly becoming desperate as he realizes the scope of the federal case against him, Margaret observed. His attempts to arrange private meetings and his supposed revelation of new evidence are classic tactics used by criminal defendants trying to avoid prosecution. That evening, I received an unexpected call from Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a research colleague at Oregon State University, whom I had collaborated with on several agricultural sustainability projects. Her voice was tense with concern as she explained the reason for her call. Sarah, I need to tell you something disturbing, she began. Marcus contacted me yesterday, claiming that you've been falsely accusing him of stealing your work and asking me to provide testimony that your innovations were actually based on his foundational research. This confirmation of Marcus's witness tampering efforts was exactly what federal prosecutors had warned me to expect. He was apparently conducting a systematic campaign to discredit my evidence and recruit supporters for his false narrative of victimization. He was very persuasive, Dr. Martinez continued, presenting himself as a misunderstood innovator being attacked by a jealous sibling. If I hadn't known you professionally for several years and been familiar with your actual research timeline, I might have been convinced by his story. The revelation that Marcus was actively trying to manipulate my professional colleagues and research partners was both infuriating and concerning. If he succeeded in convincing even a few people to support his false claims, it could complicate the federal prosecution and damage my reputation in the agricultural technology community. What did you tell him? I asked, hoping that Dr. Martinez had refused to cooperate with his deception. I told him that I was familiar with your research timeline and couldn't provide the kind of testimony he was seeking, she replied. But Sarah, he seemed genuinely convinced that he was the victim in this situation. Either he's an incredible actor, or he's actually managed to convince himself that his version of events is true. The possibility that Marcus had genuinely deluded himself into believing his own lies was both psychologically fascinating and deeply troubling. But regardless of his mental state or self-perception, the documented evidence of his systematic theft and fraud made his criminal liability clear and undeniable. As I reflected on the day's developments, the federal prosecutor's case outline, Marcus's desperate attempts to arrange private meetings, and his witness tampering efforts, I realized that we were approaching the climactic phase of this legal and family crisis. Marcus's increasingly desperate actions suggested that he understood the gravity of his situation and was willing to take significant risks to avoid accountability. What none of us anticipated was that Marcus's next move would be so reckless and self-destructive that it would provide federal prosecutors with irrefutable evidence of additional crimes while simultaneously destroying any remaining sympathy for his position within our family and professional community. The call from Margaret Walsh came at 7:30 in the morning, waking me from restless sleep filled with dreams about courtrooms and family confrontations. Her voice carried an urgency that immediately put me on high, alert, suggesting that something significant had developed overnight in our case against Marcus. "Sarah, you need to get to my office immediately," she said without preamble. The Patent Office Investigation Division called me at 6 a.m. with information that changes everything about this case. They've discovered something about Marcus's patent applications that's even more damaging than we realized. I was dressed and in my car within 20 minutes, my mind racing through possibilities of what the USPTO investigators might have uncovered. We had already established that Marcus's patent applications were fraudulent, based on stolen technology with falsified development timelines. What additional revelation could be significant enough to prompt an emergency early morning meeting? Margaret's office was already bustling with activity when I arrived, despite the early hour. Her investigative team had apparently been working through the night, and the conference room table was covered with printed documents, computer printouts, and official-looking correspondence bearing the United States Patent and Trademark Office letterhead. "Sarah, sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "What I'm about to tell you is going to be shocking, even given everything we've already discovered about Marcus's criminal activities." She pulled out a thick folder marked USPTO Investigation, Confidential, and opened it to reveal a series of official documents that appeared to be internal Patent Office correspondence and investigative reports. The Patent Office Investigation Division has been conducting their own inquiry into Marcus's fraudulent applications, Margaret began, but in the process, they discovered something that none of us anticipated. Marcus didn't just steal your innovations and file false patents, he's been operating an entire fraudulent patent mill. The term patent mill was familiar to me from my work in technology development. It referred to operations that systematically filed large numbers of low-quality or fraudulent patents, often for the purpose of creating licensing revenue through legal intimidation rather than legitimate innovation. But the suggestion that Marcus had been operating such an enterprise was stunning in its implications. "What exactly did they find?" I asked, though I was almost afraid to hear the answer. Margaret consulted the investigative report. Over the past 4 years, Marcus has filed 247 patent applications under various names and through different corporate entities. The Patent Office investigators have determined that at least 180 of these applications involve stolen or plagiarized technology from other inventors. 247 fraudulent patents. The scale of Marcus's criminal enterprise was far beyond anything I had imagined. This wasn't just about stealing my agricultural innovations. It was about systematic intellectual property theft, affecting potentially hundreds of inventors and researchers across multiple technology sectors. "How is that even possible?" I asked, struggling to comprehend the logistics of such massive fraud. Wouldn't the Patent Office have noticed patterns or inconsistencies in that many applications? "That's exactly what eventually triggered their investigation," Margaret replied. Marcus was sophisticated enough to use different corporate entities, law firms, and even different names to file patents. But he made critical errors that allowed investigators to connect the applications to a single source. She pulled out a complex flowchart that the Patent Office investigators had created, showing the relationships between various corporate entities, law firms, and patent applications that Marcus had used to disguise his fraudulent activities. The breakthrough came when investigators noticed that multiple patent applications from different sources contained identical technical errors and typos that appeared in your original research documents, Margaret continued. These textual fingerprints allowed them to trace dozens of supposedly independent patents back to the same source materials, your stolen work. The realization that my innovations had been used as the foundation for not just Marcus's direct theft, but for an entire fraudulent patent empire was both vindicating and horrifying. It meant that my work had been exploited on a scale that none of us had previously understood. "But there's more," Margaret said, her expression becoming even more serious. "The Patent Office investigation revealed that Marcus has been licensing these fraudulent patents to companies across the country, generating millions of dollars in revenue from intellectual property that was either stolen or completely fabricated." She handed me a financial summary that the investigators had compiled, showing licensing agreements and revenue streams that totaled over $25 million across the 4-year period of Marcus's operation. $25 million. The number was staggering, representing not just the scale of Marcus's financial fraud, but the enormous damage he had inflicted on legitimate inventors whose work had been stolen and monetized without their knowledge or consent. "This explains why Marcus has been so desperate to avoid prosecution," Margaret observed. "He's not just facing charges related to stealing your work. He's potentially looking at federal conspiracy charges for operating a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise that has victimized hundreds of inventors." The implications for Marcus's legal situation were devastating. Federal conspiracy charges for operating a continuing criminal enterprise carried sentences measured in decades rather than years, and the financial restitution requirements would likely bankrupt him even if he avoided prison. "What about the other victims?" I asked, thinking about the hundreds of inventors whose work had apparently been stolen and monetized by Marcus's patent mill operation. "That's one of the most tragic aspects of this discovery," Margaret replied. "Many of the victims don't even know their work has been stolen because Marcus was careful to target researchers and inventors who weren't actively monitoring patent filings in their areas of expertise." She pulled out a list that the Patent Office investigators had compiled, showing the names and affiliations of inventors whose work had been incorporated into Marcus's fraudulent patents. The list included university researchers, independent inventors, small technology companies, and even graduate students whose thesis work had been appropriated and commercialized without their knowledge. The Patent Office is planning to contact all identified victims to inform them of the theft and provide them with information about joining the federal prosecution, Margaret continued. "This case is going to become one of the largest intellectual property fraud prosecutions in recent history." As I absorbed the magnitude of what had been revealed, my phone rang with a call from Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Morrison. Margaret gestured for me to answer, indicating that she was probably calling about the same USPTO investigation that we were discussing. "Ms. Chen, I assume Ms. Walsh has briefed you on the Patent Office findings," Morrison said immediately upon my answering. "This discovery fundamentally changes the scope and significance of our case against your brother." "It's overwhelming," I admitted. I knew Marcus had stolen my work, but I had no idea he was operating this kind of systematic fraud operation. The federal charges we're now considering include conspiracy to commit wire fraud, mail fraud, money laundering, and operating a continuing criminal enterprise under RICO statutes, Morrison explained. The potential penalties have increased from a few years in prison to potentially life imprisonment, depending on how we structure the charges. Life imprisonment. The possibility that Marcus could spend the rest of his life in federal prison was both a vindication of the seriousness of his crimes and a source of genuine grief for me. Despite everything he had done, he was still my brother, and the thought of him dying in prison was genuinely painful. "There's something else you need to know," Morrison continued. "Late yesterday evening, your brother attempted to flee the country. He was detained at SeaTac Airport trying to board a flight to Singapore with false identification documents. The news that Marcus had attempted to flee the country was shocking, but not entirely surprising given his increasingly desperate behavior over the past weeks. The use of false identification documents would add additional federal charges to his already extensive criminal liability. Is he in custody now?" Margaret asked, apparently listening to our conversation. "He's been arrested and is being held without bail pending arraignment on federal charges," Morrison replied. The attempted flight with false documents demonstrates both consciousness of guilt and flight risk, so he won't be released before trial. As I hung up with Morrison, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that Marcus could no longer continue, his criminal activities or attempt to destroy evidence, vindication that the scope of his crimes was finally being recognized by federal authorities, and genuine sadness that my brother's choices had led him to this point. Sarah, there's one more thing from the Patent Office investigation that you need to know, Margaret said, consulting the final documents in her folder. The investigators discovered that Marcus has been attempting to sell his entire fraudulent patent portfolio to foreign companies, potentially allowing stolen American innovations to be exploited internationally. The revelation that Marcus had been trying to sell American intellectual property to foreign companies added national security implications to his already extensive criminal liability. It meant that his crimes weren't just about personal financial gain, but potentially about compromising American technological competitiveness. The good news, Margaret continued, is that the Patent Office has been able to block these international sales and is working with federal authorities to ensure that any stolen technology doesn't leave the country. As our meeting concluded, I reflected on how the situation had evolved from my initial discovery of Marcus's conference presentations to the revelation of a massive international patent fraud operation. What had started as a family dispute over stolen innovation had become one of the largest intellectual property crime cases in federal prosecution history. The telephone rang as Margaret and I were organizing the documentation for our next meeting with federal prosecutors. It was my mother, her voice filled with a combination of shock, grief, and confusion that reflected the devastating impact of Marcus's arrest on our family. Sarah, I just got a call from a federal agent telling me that Marcus has been arrested, she said, her voice breaking with emotion. They said he was trying to leave the country with fake identification. I don't understand what's happening anymore. The conversation with my mother was one of the most difficult of my life. Explaining that Marcus had been operating a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise that had victimized hundreds of inventors was almost impossible for her to comprehend, given that she had raised him to believe in honesty and ethical behavior. The federal agents want to interview your father and me about Marcus's activities and finances, she continued. They said we might have unknowingly benefited from his criminal activities if he used stolen money to help our family over the years. The possibility that Marcus had used proceeds from his patent fraud operation to provide financial assistance to our parents added another layer of complexity and pain to an already devastating situation. It meant that our entire family might have been unknowingly complicit in his criminal enterprise. As I drove home that evening, I processed the day's revelations about the true scope of Marcus's crimes and their impact on hundreds of victims across the country. The Patent Office investigation had revealed that my brother wasn't just a sibling who had betrayed family trust. He was a criminal mastermind who had built a multi-million-dollar enterprise based on systematic intellectual property theft. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's downfall had ultimately come from his theft of my work. The textual fingerprints and technical errors that connected his fraudulent patent empire back to my original research had provided federal investigators with the evidence they needed to unravel his entire criminal operation. What I didn't know then was that Marcus's arrest and the revelation of his patent mill operation would trigger an avalanche of additional evidence and victim testimony that would make his prosecution one of the most significant intellectual property crime cases in federal court history, with implications that would reshape how the Patent Office investigates and prevents fraudulent applications. 6 months after Marcus's arrest at SeaTac Airport, I sat in the packed federal courtroom watching my brother stand before Judge Patricia Hamilton for his sentencing hearing. The transformation in his appearance was striking. Gone was the confident, charismatic man who had charmed investors and stolen innovations with equal ease. In his place stood someone who looked genuinely broken, wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, his once perfect hair unkempt, and his face gaunt from months in federal detention. The proceedings had taken on a significance far beyond our family dispute. Marcus's case had become a landmark prosecution for intellectual property crime, attracting national media attention and observers from the patent law community, technology industry, and academic research institutions. The courtroom gallery was filled with victims of his patent mill operation, federal investigators, journalists, and legal experts who recognized the historic nature of the case. Assistant U.S. Attorney Rachel Morrison stood to address the court, her voice carrying the weight of 6 months of investigation that had uncovered the full scope of Marcus's criminal enterprise. The final tally was staggering: 312 fraudulent patent applications, $31 million in illegal licensing revenue, and 284 identified victims whose intellectual property had been stolen and commercialized without their knowledge or consent. Your Honor, Morrison began, the defendant operated one of the most sophisticated and damaging intellectual property theft operations in modern American history. Over 4 years, Marcus Chen systematically stole innovations from hundreds of inventors, researchers, and small companies, filing fraudulent patents and licensing agreements that generated tens of millions of dollars in illegal revenue. She gestured toward a display screen showing a complex network diagram that federal investigators had created to illustrate the scope of Marcus's operation. The web of corporate entities, shell companies, and fraudulent patent applications was mind-boggling in its complexity and criminal ambition. The damage extends far beyond financial loss, Morrison continued. Mr. Chen's crimes undermined the fundamental integrity of our patent system, discouraged legitimate innovation, and caused immeasurable harm to inventors who watched their life's work stolen and commercialized by someone who contributed nothing to technological progress. Judge Hamilton, a respected jurist with over 20 years of experience in federal intellectual property cases, listened intently as Morrison outlined the prosecution's sentencing recommendation. The federal guidelines suggested a sentence of 25 to 30 years in federal prison, along with restitution payments totaling over $40 million when penalties and interest were included. Marcus's defense attorney, Thomas Richardson, rose to present mitigation arguments that felt hollow, given the overwhelming evidence of systematic criminal behavior. He spoke about Marcus's difficult childhood, career pressures, and claimed mental health issues, but his arguments were undermined by the calculated sophistication of the patent mill operation and Marcus's attempts to flee the country when the YD investigation intensified. Mr. Chen's actions represent a moment of poor judgment that spiraled out of control, Richardson argued, though his voice lacked conviction. He recognizes the harm he has caused and seeks the court's mercy in considering a sentence that allows for rehabilitation and eventual reintegration into society. The victim impact portion of the hearing was the most emotionally powerful part of the proceedings. One by one, inventors and researchers whose work had been stolen stood to address the court about the damage Marcus's crimes had inflicted on their careers, financial security, and faith in the innovation system. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a university researcher whose agricultural sustainability innovations had been stolen and commercialized by Marcus, spoke with quiet dignity about discovering that her years of research had been appropriated and sold to corporations that had paid Marcus millions for technology she had developed. I spent 3 years developing water conservation algorithms that could help farmers reduce environmental impact while maintaining crop yields, she told the judge. When I discovered that Mr. Chen had patented my work and sold licenses worth over $2 million, I felt violated in a way that's difficult to describe. It wasn't just theft, it was the erasure of my contribution to technology that could help address climate change. Michael Torres, the independent inventor whose manufacturing process innovations had been stolen early in Marcus's criminal enterprise, described the devastating impact on his small engineering company when he discovered that patents he thought he owned were being licensed by someone else. My company went bankrupt fighting legal battles over patents that were rightfully mine, he said, his voice heavy with years of struggle. Mr. Chen didn't just steal my innovations, he destroyed my business and the jobs of 12 employees who trusted me to protect our intellectual property. When my turn came to address the court, I felt the weight of representing not just my own experience, but the collective harm Marcus had inflicted on the entire innovation community. I looked directly at my brother as I spoke, hoping to convey both the damage he had caused and the necessity of holding him accountable. Your Honor, Marcus is my brother, and I love him despite everything he has done. I began, my voice steady, despite the emotional difficulty of the moment. But his crimes represent more than just personal betrayal. They represent an attack on the fundamental principles that drive technological progress and innovation in America. I described the 2 years I had spent developing the agricultural technology that Marcus had stolen. The late nights in laboratories, the field tests with farmers, the careful documentation of results that had made the theft possible to prove. But I also spoke about the broader implications of his patent mill operation for the research community and the innovation economy. When inventors can't trust that their work will be protected, when researchers discover that their innovations have been stolen and commercialized by criminals, the entire system that drives technological progress is undermined, I continued. Marcus's crimes didn't just harm his direct victims, they damaged faith in the patent system that protects legitimate innovation. Marcus was given the opportunity to address the court before sentencing. He stood slowly, his shackles rattling, in the quiet courtroom, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the brother I had grown up with, vulnerable, uncertain, and genuinely remorseful. Your Honor, I take full responsibility for the crimes I committed, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. There is no excuse for what I did, no justification for stealing other people's work and building a business on deception and fraud. He paused, struggling with emotion, before continuing. I want to apologize especially to my sister Sarah, whose trust I betrayed and whose innovations I stole. She had every right to pursue justice against me, and I understand that my actions have destroyed our family relationship and damaged countless other lives. For the first time since this ordeal began, Marcus seemed to genuinely understand the scope of his crimes and their impact on others. His apology felt authentic rather than strategic, though it could never undo the damage he had caused. I also want to apologize to every inventor, researcher, and entrepreneur whose work I stole, he continued. I know that words cannot repair the harm I've caused, but I want the court and the victims to know that I understand the magnitude of what I did and accept full responsibility for the consequences. Judge Hamilton deliberated for nearly an hour before returning to deliver the sentence. The courtroom was completely silent as she addressed Marcus directly, her voice carrying the authority of federal justice and the weight of precedent that would influence future intellectual property crime prosecutions. Mr. Chen, your crimes represent one of the most extensive and systematic intellectual property theft operations this court has ever encountered, she began. The evidence demonstrates not momentary lapses in judgment, but a calculated criminal enterprise that operated for years and caused tens of millions of dollars in damage to victims across the country. She consulted her notes before continuing. However, the court also recognizes your acceptance of responsibility and genuine remorse expressed here today. These factors, while they cannot excuse your crimes, do provide some mitigation in determining an appropriate sentence. Judge Hamilton sentenced Marcus to 18 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. The restitution order totaled $42 million to be distributed among the identified victims according to a formula that federal authorities would develop. Additionally, Marcus was permanently banned from filing patent applications or engaging in technology licensing activities. 18 years. The sentence was substantial, but less than the maximum guidelines, reflecting both the seriousness of Marcus's crimes and the court's recognition of his apparent genuine remorse. It meant that Marcus would be in his late 40s, When released, essentially ensuring that his prime professional years would be spent in federal prison. As the court proceedings concluded and Marcus was led away in shackles, I felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that justice had been served, and that Marcus could no longer victimize other inventors. Sadness that my brother's choices had led him to this devastating outcome, and a strange sense of closure after months of legal proceedings and family trauma. My parents, who had attended every day of the trial despite their obvious pain, approached me in the courthouse hallway. My mother's eyes were red from crying, but her expression was resolute. "Sarah, I want you to know that your father and I support the sentence," she said, her voice heavy with emotion but clear in its conviction. "What Marcus did was wrong, and you were right to pursue justice even though it tore our family apart." My father nodded in agreement. "We raised both of you to believe in honesty and hard work. Marcus chose to abandon those values, and he has to face the consequences of that choice. We're proud of you for standing up for what's right, even when it was difficult." The support from my parents was deeply meaningful, representing their ability to choose justice over family loyalty when the two came into conflict. It also suggested that our family relationships, while forever changed by Marcus's crimes, might eventually heal in ways that honored both accountability and love. The aftermath of Marcus's sentencing brought unexpected opportunities and recognition for my legitimate innovations. Agricultural Dynamics Corporation, freed from their fraudulent licensing agreement with Marcus, entered into a proper partnership with Green Tech Solutions to commercialize my smart irrigation technology. The publicity from the federal case had also attracted attention from other agricultural equipment manufacturers, universities, and research institutions interested in licensing or collaborating on my innovations. Within a year of Marcus's sentencing, my agricultural technology patents were generating substantial licensing revenue that allowed me to establish my own research and development company focused on sustainable farming innovations. The recognition and financial success felt like justice in its own right, proof that legitimate innovation and ethical behavior ultimately prevailed over theft and deception. I also became an advocate for patent system reform and intellectual property protection, speaking at conferences and working with federal legislators to develop better mechanisms for detecting and preventing fraudulent patent applications. The experience of being victimized by systematic IP theft had given me insights into vulnerabilities in the system that needed to be addressed to protect other inventors. 2 years after Marcus's sentencing, I received an unexpected letter from him in federal prison. The letter was brief, but seemed genuine in its continued expression of remorse and acceptance of responsibility. He wrote about using his time in prison to pursue education and prepare for eventual reintegration into society, though he acknowledged that his criminal record would severely limit his future professional opportunities. "I know I can never undo the damage I caused," he wrote, "but I want you to know that I think about it every day and am committed to living differently when I'm eventually released. I hope that someday you might be able to forgive me, though I understand if that's not possible." I didn't respond to the letter immediately, needing time to process my feelings about potential reconciliation with Marcus. The brother who had stolen my work and operated a criminal enterprise was also the person I had grown up with, shared childhood memories with, and loved, despite everything he had done. Eventually, I did write back, a brief note acknowledging his letter and expressing hope that he would indeed use his time in prison constructively. I stopped short of forgiveness, which felt premature given the scope of his crimes and their ongoing impact on victims, but I left open the possibility that our relationship might someday be rebuilt on a foundation of honesty and accountability. The Tsai case of Marcus Chen became a landmark in federal intellectual property prosecution, cited in legal journals and used as a teaching example in law schools and business ethics courses. The patent mill operation he had constructed, and the sophisticated methods he had used to steal and commercialize other people's innovations, became the subject of academic research into criminal enterprises in the technology sector. For me, the experience had been simultaneously devastating and transformative. Marcus's theft had nearly destroyed my career and faith in family relationships, but pursuing justice had ultimately led to greater recognition for my legitimate innovations and a deeper understanding of my own values and priorities. The smart irrigation technology that had started this entire ordeal was now being used on farms across the country, helping agricultural producers reduce water consumption while maintaining crop yields. Seeing my innovations actually making a positive impact on sustainable agriculture was more meaningful than any amount of licensing revenue or professional recognition. As I reflected on the 3-year journey from discovering Marcus's theft to watching him sentenced for his crimes, I understood that the real victory wasn't his punishment, but the protection and advancement of legitimate innovation. The patent system's integrity had been defended, other inventors had been protected from future victimization, and technological progress continued unimpeded by criminal interference. Marcus's case had taught me that innovation isn't just about technical creativity. It's about the ethical foundation that supports trust, collaboration, and progress in the research community. When that foundation is attacked by fraud and theft, defending it becomes essential not just for individual victims, but for the entire ecosystem that drives technological advancement. The story of my brother's betrayal and the justice that followed had become something larger than a family dispute. It represented the ongoing struggle between legitimate innovation and criminal exploitation, between honest research and systematic fraud, between accountability and enabling destructive behavior. In the end, justice had prevailed, innovation had been protected, and the Patent Office had revealed the truth that Marcus never expected: that sophisticated criminal enterprises ultimately collapse under the weight of their own deception, and that the integrity of legitimate innovation will always triumph over the profits of theft. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.